Well, I'm delighted to be here at the Hand in Hand conference this year digitally. And of course, everything's being done digitally right now because of the pandemic that we're in the middle of. I'm sure you probably remember well the moments that you realized that everything was going to change because COVID-19 had become a global emergency. For me, there were a few moments. It was the email from my university informing faculty that the online teaching contingency plans we put in place were in effect immediately. There was the announcement from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who said, if you're abroad, it's time to come home. And there are the scenes of empty streets in countries that had already been hit very hard by the virus. In the weeks that followed lockdown and the beginning of what would become months and months of quarantine, my social media pages were flooded with notes and images and videos from pastors who were doing everything that they could to move their Sunday worship services online. A wise colleague noticed that the proliferation of comments from pandemic-era pastors about how to do virtual church spoke volumes about just how much value pastors attribute to that 1 hour of corporate worship on Sunday mornings. All the stuff that happens outside of weekly worship services, things like pastoral care, social justice initiatives, faith formation events, and even church administration, it all suddenly seemed to take a back seat as all hands went on deck to set up online worship services. So 2 months later, I was sitting in front of my computer, as many of us do often now, in a Zoom meeting with leaders in intergenerational ministry across the globe. All of us agreed that the move to online worship seems to result in steps backward in our quests to foster faith intergenerationally. Despite the best efforts of creative ministry practitioners, experiences of church were becoming more segregated by age in this virtual environment that people were figuring out together. And children and young people, especially, were becoming neglected along the way. It became clear that COVID was here to stay, and pastoral leaders knew that the ad hoc measures that they put in place to keep their community together during the first weeks of the pandemic had to change. Necessity is the mother of invention, the old proverb reminds us, and the church was in need of some radically inventive changes if it was going to weather the storm. So Zoom worship, pastoral care through FaceTime, parish WhatsApp groups, these are just some of the many and creative ways that churches have responded to the ongoing reality of the pandemic. And although it seemed like leaders were pushing children's ministry near the bottom of their liturgical lists, some of the most exciting work for ministry with children and ministry in intergenerational contexts are being forged right now, not in spite of the pandemic, but because we're in a pandemic. Walter Brueggemann opens his book, Virus as a Summons to Faith, by stating that the lingering impact of the virus has summoned our best science to respond to human emergency. That lingering impact has also invited fresh theological consideration. As challenging as this new normal has been, it has indeed invited and even required new theological ideas and practices, because we can't do things the way we used to do them, even if we wanted to. Now, it's been a difficult year, and I want to offer some hope for the future. God is present in this new day in which we find ourselves, calling us to faithfully proclaim the gospel and form disciples here, there, and everywhere. And I want to address each of these contexts in turn. So first, let's talk about faith formation here in our churches. Now, once knowledge about the novel coronavirus increased, along with the realization that it was going to be here to stay, many congregations and local parishes gradually opened their doors and put plans in place to worship in person once again, at least when it was safe to do so. A lot had to change to make this possible. Communion sometimes became a practice for clergy alone, if it was practiced at all. And instead of singing hymns, congregants now listened to them as they were played instrumentally, or maybe they hummed along from behind face masks. Lay involvement during worship became limited to 1 or 2 participants in order to limit movement in the sanctuary from different readers and different prayer leaders. But many churches struggled with how to incorporate children into our COVID-19 era face-to-face worship. As churches were opening, at least in some contexts, in the latter months of 2020, I had a number of opportunities to share about approaches to children's faith formation and about ideas for intergenerational ministry through webinars and podcasts and Zoom presentations. And I heard from congregational leaders around the world that many models and methods that worked very well before 2020 are nearly impossible to carry out through this pandemic era ministry. You're probably feeling a similar thing. What if, when it comes to in-person ministry and worship in the midst of COVID-19, our role as children's ministry leaders is not to plow ahead and figure out how to best take what we did before the pandemic and set it up within our current health restrictions? What if instead we're called to resist the all too easy urge to allow our socially distant worship services to take us backward in progress we've made? What if we're called to advocate even harder for the importance of children in God's mission? This is not a passive thing. It's an active resistance to the status quo that involves calling attention to those among our community who are unheard because of their age, to those who struggle to be part of worship services that require people to sit down and sit still and 6 feet or 2 meters apart from one another for an hour. In fact, it's a call to explore brand new ways of worshiping together that are only going to emerge because of the unique and the challenging times in which we find ourselves. Now, the challenges involved in ministering with children are opportunities to revitalize and to rethink faith formation here in churches, but also there in people's homes. Now, 40 years ago, Pope John Paul II promoted an ecclesiological vision of the family, writing, "The Christian family constitutes a special revelation and realization of ecclesial communion. And for this reason, too, it can and should be called the domestic church." As a church in miniature, as he called it, the family is in ongoing and intentional need for evangelism and education for the salvation and the formation of its members. The pandemic has pushed many people to expand their understandings of what constitutes a family. As everyone sheltered in place within their homes, it became clear that some families were made up of a combination of parents and children, but others involved multi-generational configurations of both biological members and in-laws. And still others consisted of friends, roommates, and other cohabitants who acted as a family unit to one another in the same space. While John Paul II may not have had these sort of groups in mind when he wrote his encyclical 40 years ago, the sort of households that make appearances in the Bible many years earlier, according to James Francis, were more extensive than in modern times. And they included not only immediate family, but a wide spectrum of kinship grouping and retainers. So there's some solid biblical precedent for the domestic church to configure itself in all sorts of ways. The need to shelter in place has certainly shed light on the importance of the domestic church, even if it's also been a source of anxiety for parents and grandparents and other adults in the family. The professionalization of ministry over the last few generations has meant that many congregants don't know what to do to nurture their faith and to nurture the faith of their family members now that access to pastoral professionals is limited. Just as people weighed the options when they could no longer visit their professional barbers and stylists, families need to decide what to do now that they can't rely on ministry professionals for the spiritual nourishment of their families. We can do nothing and let our hair grow long as we wait out the storm, or we can take matters into our own hands, pick up a pair of scissors, and try something, try anything to respond to our family's needs. In this climate, rather than being the primary source of formational wisdom in the congregation, we who are leaders can empower and equip families with tools and resources to form one another in their own households. This does not mean that the adults in the home, the parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, for example, teach the young. Instead, it means that everyone has something to contribute as we all spur one another toward greater faithfulness. The group gathered today has a wealth of resources in its collective toolbox, so let's be sure to share as much of it with each other while we have the chance. So the pandemic is a call to reinvent our work here in the church and there in homes. But perhaps the clearest call it offers is for us to experiment with ministry everywhere through digital communication. Thanks to the proliferation of live streaming entertainment in the years leading up to 2020, when stay-at-home orders were issued, more people than ever before had technological equipment and connectivity that helped them not simply to give up their day-to-day interactions, but to move them online. And the church was part of this mass migration into virtual spaces. Now, there are, of course, many people who don't have access to the same technological and internet um, uh, needs in order to maintain connections during the pandemic in digital spaces. And we need to work with them to find ways to provide them with what they need, both in terms of the material technology and also the socialization and the connection and the relationship and the continuity of relationships as things go forward. But speaking of the digital realm, though, there are no experts in the wild world of online pandemic era ministry. Of course, there were leaders in digital ministry before 2020, but none of us were prepared for what was going to happen when COVID-19 forced online ministry to evolve from one aspect of a church's ministry to the primary locus at which the church participates in God's mission in the world. We are all, in a sense, in a sort of wilderness. We're living in an age that requires experimentation in digital ministry. And we're all learning to interpret and proclaim and experience the gospel together. The dramatic restructurings of parish life and congregational worship in online spaces challenges us to engage in a process of letting go and letting be and letting come, a rhythm that Brian McLaren urged the church to consider about a decade ago. In his words, we need to let go of long-held assumptions, many of which we are hardly aware of. We need to let be, to not rush or push, but maintain a posture of receptivity. In that posture of heart, we can let come and see what new possibilities emerge. Each of these three moves allow pastoral leaders and congregants alike to actively work toward ongoing faithfulness and discipleship through our screens. Much of what congregations faced during the pastoral triage that resulted in online worship involved letting go. We've had to let go of the assumptions and practices surrounding church life, surrounding how we minister with children, surrounding how we do faith formation that had become embedded within our communities. We've had to let go of what worship looks like, how we build community, and what we do to teach and preach the gospel. And as we let go of all these ideas and experiences, we make room for new ones to be created. But in order to generate new ideas and practices about what it means to be a worshiping and faith-forming community, it's important to let be what is in this moment. This is an active and intentional process of being receptive to what God is saying to us and discerning what God is doing through us right now. Doing ministry through a screen is not simply a different medium for the same ministries. It involves rethinking the work we're doing and digging down to the base foundations on which our ministerial practices rest. Like rescue teams after a disaster, it involves surveying the scene, rescuing those who need the most urgent help, and picking through the remnants to see what can be salvaged as we think about how to rebuild our lives. It also requires that we take time to grieve all that we've lost, and we have lost a lot, and to allow ourselves to feel the anxiety that comes through all the uncertainties with which we live in order to move through them together. As we continue to let go of what must be and to save what we can, we let come into the world what will be on the other side of this crisis. Now, this involves both using the resources that we've salvaged and creating new resources through innovation and ingenuity. It means we become bricoleurs, a French-inspired term that refers to tinkering with the tools that we've inherited and the resources we have at our disposal to create something useful for us in our present circumstances. Sociologist Robert Wadnow explains this well. He says, the key to understanding the life of a bricoleur or tinkerer is uncertainty. The tinkerer's life is sufficiently uncertain that it's impossible to solve problems with predefined solutions. A tinkerer does not go to the store and look for exactly the right part that will fit their plow. Instead, they muse about the problem, talk about it with neighbors to see if they've ever faced the same difficulty, go out into the junk pile and find the old piece of angle iron and a tin can to cut up, and use their skills as a craftsperson to piece together a makeshift solution. This sort of ingenuity and creative problem solving relies on the resources we have in the junk piles of our ecclesial backyards. What we find, what we do with these parts and scraps, and how we use them to solve the challenges before us is up to each and every one of us. Since none of us are experts of ministry during a pandemic, we can only build the new church one idea and one practice at a time. Letting go, letting be, letting come. These are not sequential steps. In crisis situations like the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to engage in all three practices and be in all three postures at many different times, and sometimes at the very same time. It's a messy process and it's a chaotic process, but it's necessary for discerning how God is calling us toward even greater faithfulness as we minister with the children and the families that God has placed in our midst. Now, as people fled cities and towns during pandemics that ravaged the world many centuries ago, there were groups of Christians who stayed put in order to nurse the sick and care for the poor. And they often paid the price for their compassion with their own lives. Their actions proclaimed the love of God in a world that desperately needed to know the truth of that message. In our age of despair and uncertainty, we, the church, we are called to join God in forming one another and being formed by one another into people who teach God's love and preach God's hope. The call to do this work is consistent, but how we go about this work is always changing. I pray that the era in which we find ourselves summons all of us to greater faithfulness, greater creativity, and greater love than we have ever known before. Amen.